My name is Mari Castañeda. I'm a professor in the Department of Communication and also Associate Dean for Equity and Inclusion in the College of Social and Behavioral Sciences. And I just wanted to welcome you and sort of set a little bit of a context with regards to the panel and the series that this is part of. I wanted to thank Scott for inviting me to do a really brief introduction. And so I just wanted to read what we have noted with regards to this particular series with regards to social science matters. So the College of Social and Behavioral Sciences, as you all know, is home to a broad range of approaches to social science, all of which we celebrate from purely theoretical and interpretive research to all manner of qualitative and quantitative research methodologies. One of our priorities is to ensure that this exciting social science research connects with the public while showing the relevance of the social sciences to everyday lives and policy. And I think today's panel really speaks to the urgency, the importance of the topic that we're going to be discussing today with regards to immigration. The Social Science Matters series showcases the contributions of various social science disciplines to pressing current societal issues. The series demonstrates the cross-disciplinary connections within and beyond the College of Social Behavioral Sciences and has covered topics such as inequality and resistance in past iterations. And I think the other thing that's really great about this particular panel as well, and some of the other panels that we've hosted, is also bringing our 5 college community colleagues and friends to be part of the conversation that's not just across campus, but also across the 5 colleges in the Valley. So the theme for this year is critical issues for the 2020 election cycle, and will feature experts discussing policy and intellectual questions around immigration, healthcare, and other timely and relevant topics. And again, we'll be joined from speakers from both across campus, 5 colleges, and in some cases even from across the country. So I wanted to thank you all again for being here. I think it's really important to be part of these dialogues and conversations, and I know that I'm looking forward to hearing you all be part of this dialogue today. So thank you.
Thank you, Mari. Thank you. This is an exciting event for me, and exciting to see so many old and new faces out in the audience. So thank you all for being here. I do want to get to what we're all here to talk about, but if you'll permit me a few more introductory words and announcements. So my name is Scott Blinder. I'm a professor here in the Political Science Department. I co-organize, along with my colleague in the front row, Rebecca Hamlin, a working group on migration that is a diverse, interdisciplinary group of faculty and graduate students that meets to discuss each other's work, support one another, and also to sponsor or co-sponsor events like this. If anyone would like to be they're part of the group or just keep apprised on events and be on our mailing list, please do feel free to get in touch with either Rebecca or me. So I'm just Scott Blinder at UMass.edu, and I'd be happy to welcome new people to the group and to the list. I wanted to quickly announce the next event that we are co-sponsoring is one in a series of film viewings and discussions that our group is co-sponsoring along with the Center for Teaching and Learning on campus here. These are opportunities to watch and discuss films about different aspects of migration, and the next one is coming up on the evening of December 3rd, right here at the Old Chapel. It is a film called Mediterranean. It's a feature-length film in which it follows 2 men making a journey from Africa to Italy, facing hostility, facing violence, in, quote, is the shocking look at the life and death struggle of refugees. So film and pizza at 5 p.m. on December 3rd, right here. Okay, a few more introductory words now focused on our wonderful group of panelists that I just couldn't be more pleased to have all 3 of them here with us today. And this is nice, they're seated in alphabetical order, which is how they were going to be introduced anyway. So starting to my immediate left, we have David Hernandez, who is an associate professor of Latino Studies at Mount Holyoke, so one of our 5 college neighbors. His research focuses primarily on immigration enforcement, especially the U.S. detention regimes. So an incredibly timely topic that a lot of us are concerned about right now. He's working on a book manuscript that is tentatively titled Alien Incarcerations, Immigrant Detention, and Lesser Citizenship. His work has been published in numerous journals as well as many more public-facing outlets, so anything from Latino Studies, the Journal of Race and Policy, to essays and reports in the American Quarterly, Aslan, Contemporary Sociology, the Law of Society Review. He has received research fellowships and funding from the National Science Foundation, the Ford Foundation, the Social Science Research Council, and the Center for Latino Initiatives at the Smithsonian Institution. So that should, no wonder you've been so busy. Seated in the center, we have Debbie Schildkraut, Professor of Political Science at Tufts University and a leading expert on public opinion in matters of immigration and American national identity. And Debbie is the author of, or co-author of numerous books and articles, including 2 really landmark research monographs, the most recent of which, Americanism in the 21st Century, Public Opinion in the Age of Immigration, was published by Cambridge University Press and won the Robert Lane Award as the best book published in political psychology from the American Political Science Association organized section. And then on the far left today, we have Abigail Williamson, who is an associate professor of political science and public policy and law at Trinity College in Hartford. She works on immigration policy as well as health policy and urban politics and political behavior. And her book, you didn't know you were going to get a free plug, just like being on the Tonight Show. This is her recently published 2018 book called Welcoming New Americans, Local Governments, and Immigrant Incorporation. And we'll be hearing a lot more about Abby's research on this kind of underexamined, understudied, but very important and timely topic. She's also currently working with an interdisciplinary team on a project called Americans' Conceptions of Health Equity, which examines how people form and change their understandings of whose health deserves society's attention and investment. And she's done research funded by the Pew Charitable Trust, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, the Ruth Landis Memorial Fund, Time-Sharing Experiments in the Social Sciences, and the Zeit Foundation's Scholarship in Migration Studies. So I, and I'm sure all of us, are extremely grateful to have this group here today, and I'm just going to sort of try to kick things off and keep things moving along, but I've told the panelists that I'm happy to have them sort of take charge of the agenda and respond to one another however they see fit, and I think we're really lucky that we have 3 folks here with different but sort of intertwining, overlapping bits of expertise. So we're going to throw a few things out there, we're going to talk for a while, and then we will reserve time at the end, certainly, for hopefully all of your questions. I'm sure with this crowd you'll be raring to go by the time we open it up. So to get us started, I thought maybe we could sort of tackle the issue of what, well, I think what we've all been wondering about is what in the world is going on right now in the world in the last 3 years in particular. We're looking ahead to the 2020 election cycle, but also as a way of framing that, what is going on in this current era under the presidency of Donald Trump, and pointing to sort of in each of your areas what is new, what's going on currently at the moment, what's different, but also I think in some cases there may be important and surprising continuities, things that maybe haven't changed as much as we think. So maybe we'll just go in the same order and start with David. So what's going on? What's new? And what, if anything, is more or less the same as it's been?
And I don't have to hold this, do I?
Well, we'll see.
Yes?
Can you guys hear?
Hold it. Okay, I'm holding it.
Better? Okay.
What's new? I mean, well, first there's a lot the same. You know, we have an intense, in terms of immigration enforcement, we have an intense deportation and detention regime that was set up by the previous president, which was also set up by that previous president, and so on. So in many ways, that is very similar. I'm sure my fellow panelists can comment that there's two really big changes, I would say, amongst the other things that President Trump has brought on is especially a complete assault on asylum, almost a smothering, what I would call a smothering of the asylum system, from raising fees to metering at the border to attempts at creating safe third countries in unsafe nations. And so there's that. And then I think the real big difference is the overtly nativist rhetoric coming from the White House, where in general, even under Obama, where you had the deporter-in-chief formally deporting more people than anyone prior, he still created all these small tactical avenues for relief for the kinds of immigrants that he liked, the felons and not families sort of approach, where Donald Trump is just go after everybody. And he's very vicious in his language. And as we've seen in El Paso and the Tree of Life synagogue, that the vitriol has turned into violence, you know, and that's happening right now. So that has changed, I would say.
Okay. How about with public opinion and how this is all being received?
So thank you, and thank you everyone for turning out. I know we're competing with some riveting impeachment hearings, so thank you for being here. In terms of things that are old or things that are familiar in the world of public opinion, it's always nice when we see things happening but in uncertain times when we see things happening and think, oh, we've seen this before. And there are a couple of things with immigration. One is a phenomenon called the thermostatic idea of public opinion, which is if you imagine the public's mood being like a thermostat, where instead of hot and cold, it's liberal and conservative. And so we tend to overcorrect. I'm sure you've all, you know, if you've roommates, someone turns the thermostat too high and the next person turns it too low, and you overcorrect and you're constantly going back and forth. And we see that with public opinion on a whole range of issues. When the administration changes, we vote for someone who's more to the left, and then we say, oh, we went too far, and now we go this way. And you're actually seeing a lot of that in public opinion on many questions on immigration, where we're seeing more supportive attitudes toward immigration, some of the most supportive we've ever seen. And so it's being interpreted as this correction to the Trump era in public opinion. So that fits with something that we've seen before. Something else that we see, that we've seen for a long time, is a lot of ambivalence about immigration and about immigrants, even though I just said that there's a lot of support for immigration, for legal immigration, for the notion that we're a nation of immigrants. Those numbers are really high right now. There's always a reservation about today's immigrants, and that's something that's as American as can be, right? The idea of we love immigration, but we don't necessarily love today's immigrants, and that's an old story in this country. I think what's new is the specific questions that we're asking on surveys, some of the specific policy controversies we're having right now. So should we build a wall along the border? Should our support or opposition to the president declaring a national emergency at the border? Issues of asylum. We have not asked many public opinion questions about asylum or detention at all. So figuring out what the public thinks. We don't have much to compare it to because those questions are very new. And then the alignment of immigration with partisan politics. It's maybe 15 or so years old, but again, in the history of thinking about public opinion about immigration, that's fairly new. For a long time, immigration was one of those issues where we'd always say, politics makes strange bedfellows, because you'd have people across the partisan aisle agreeing with each other, and that doesn't really happen anymore. And then one last thing that's new is, just technically speaking, in the world of polling, we've gotten a lot better in the past 10 years or so about surveying populations that are not white English-speaking populations. And so we have a lot more information than we used to have about how people from a variety of backgrounds feel about immigration, and that's only in the past decade.
Thank you.
Pass the mic.
Well, thank you very much and for the invitation to be here, and I'm glad to have this really important conversation. So what I study is how local governments respond to immigrants and then how that shapes social and political incorporation. So I'll start a little bit with what's new, but then I'll go to what's the same. So in terms of what's new, David mentioned Obama being the deporter-in-chief, so certainly that is something that is a bit of a continuity. But later in his presidency, he really did attempt to ramp back and prioritize in terms of the felons versus families that David was mentioning. And one of the things that he did was that he moved from secure communities to the priority enforcement program. And what that meant was that when local jails book detainees in, when they need to access FBI databases. And when they do that, the FBI shares that information with ICE. And that is just standard. When they book, that process occurs. And under secure communities, it was much easier to open a process that would lead to deportation. Under priority enforcement program, that became more complicated. So under Trump, he reinstated secure communities. In addition to that, he revived the 287G program, and that's a program that deputizes local and state and county officials to serve as immigration agents, essentially. You are all probably aware of his attempts to revoke funding from sanctuary cities, so that also happened. And in addition to that, something that's very important in my work is that previously there were sort of guardrails when local officials, town and county officials, decided to do things that had implications for the civil rights of immigrants. And the Trump administration, particularly under Attorney General Jeff Sessions, has really tamped down on that civil rights enforcement, and so that has lessened those guardrails. So those are some of the things that are new. The good news is that there are some continuities, and that is that what I write about in my work is that local government officials really are incentivized to welcome immigrants for a variety of reasons, and we have not seen a tremendous retrenchment in terms of their attempts to do that. So we haven't seen sanctuary cities saying, oh, well, we can't do that anymore. In fact, we've seen them challenging very openly and with great success the policies of the Trump administration. Another thing that I just want to mention that I think is very important is the Trump policies towards refugee resettlement. Under President Obama, we closed out his term with a refugee resettlement limit of 110,000. So that was the cap for the number of refugees that were going to be let in. Did Trump end up going with the zero limit for this year? So now we have a zero limit for refugees coming in the next year. And that's a really big deal. It's a really big deal, of course, because there are higher numbers of refugees throughout the world. So we have a refugee crisis in terms of the number of people that need to be resettled, and our policy isn't responding to that. But in addition to that, in my work, I write about how refugee resettlement policy, which is one of our most active, welcoming, and integrating policies when it comes to immigration and immigrant integration in the United States, that has really laid the groundwork for a lot of what local officials do in response to immigrants. And the efforts that they've made to serve bilingual, bicultural refugee policies have really spilled over to affect other immigrant communities. And the fact that that's going away, that local infrastructure that has enabled immigrant incorporation, is really challenging and problematic.
Okay. So in terms of the present sort of political/policy moment, one word that a lot of us are talking about in the context of immigration as well as sort of across the board is polarization. And it sort of was touched on. Debbie mentioned the role of partisanship as sort of one of your new things in public opinion. And one of the things that this panel wanted to address is the nature of this division. Are we sort of hopelessly divided as a country on this issue? And so I was hoping that, Deb, you might speak to the public attitude side of things, and then for David and Abby, sort of, is there room to think about ways out of this this binary sort of warring tribe situation that we're in, either in terms of confronting a detention system where as a country we've seen some really horrifying excesses taking shape. So can we unite to oppose that? And Abby, can we sort of perceive a different route to coming together more when we look at what actually happens through programs like Refugee Resettlement, or more generally how immigration works at a local level? So let's start with the sort of public opinion polarization side.
Well, so when we turn to the public to find out what they think about immigration, it's one of those issues that is simultaneously very simple but also very complex. So most Americans have this nostalgic attachment to the myth of the United States being this nation of immigrants that welcomes people, and that's something that they think makes us unique, and that they are proud that they think makes America unique. So they love that mythology. And so when you ask people, is it important that we be open to immigrants? Is it important that we give people an opportunity to start a better life? It's some of these things you don't get much partisan difference. You get a little bit, but there's a lot of support. And there are certain policy issues that get a lot more support than you would think if you're only paying attention to elected officials and how they talk about these issues. So for a long time, things like what we're now calling DACA, but before was more of a comprehensive attempt to offer anybody who was brought here undocumented as a child an opportunity to become a U.S. citizen. There has long been majority support for something like that. And there's pretty much as long as the issue of the wall has been on the agenda, it rarely, if ever, gets majority support. So on a lot of things, this notion of we are a nation of immigrants and that's who we are, and this means certain things about how we welcome people, actually gets a lot more support. And on the other side, there isn't a lot of support for being completely open borders. A lot of Americans of all backgrounds say, well, sure, we should have more border security, and yes, we should give more funding for Border Patrol. There's a lot of bipartisan support for, among the American public, for a lot of the types of issues that we hear. But at the same time, with all these new issues that are on the agenda, they can be pretty complex, and people don't really know what to make of them. And that's when, going back to what's new and what's old, one thing we also know in public opinion is when there's a new issue on the agenda, elite cues can matter a lot. So for things like, should we allow people who are coming here for asylum to stay in the U.S. while they're waiting for their hearings, or should they have to stay in Mexico? I don't know. I've never thought about that before. And they're all so they look to what the political elites are saying. And so on some of those types of things, it wouldn't be surprising that we're seeing more partisan divisions, where you see these real divides among people campaigning for the presidency and in Congress, and people defending the president's current approach. That's what people are going to look to sort out when something's new and complex. And we see that playing out with all these debates that are happening right now on those types of newer issues.
Great.
Yeah, I mean, I agree that the issue is totally polarized, but I'm not sure if the middle is even the place to go. I think that we get caught up in trying to either invoke the platitudes of the nation of immigrants and all this, and sort of a ritualized articulation of the innocence of certain immigrants in order to help them, which is completely logical and a persuasive way to go to make that argument. But what always happens with that is that those who aren't so innocent get thrown under the bus. And so, there's a challenge with that. And but there are some real innocent, quote unquote, innocent migrants that are being affected. I mean, we saw the last spring, the family separation and zero tolerance, DACA, of course, deporting veterans. So there's all these categories of migrants that need support, and in many ways you can invoke them and you can push back and maybe convince a few people, but it just seems like maybe we need a little. I'm not saying I just the middle part I think comes with a lot of strings attached, and right now it seems like we're in a very like if you read the newspaper on migration and stuff like that, there's actually quite a bit of good information in there where there never used to be, that there was lots of just misinformation or just if everything wasn't explained well. And it seems like there's a really strong public education project being brought on because of this extremist president and his advisors and his extremist advisors, white nationalist advisors. And so we're learning a lot about that, and that's good. And so I think for now, you know, the people talk about abolish ICE. I mean, some of that can be expanded to other, you know, the people are actually questioning the legitimacy of holding people to begin with. That's better than trying to find a middle ground, I think.
Can I just, before you jump in, Abby, so the observation of that there is more good information out there is an interesting one that I didn't want to let pass by, because a lot of times we talk about the media only to criticize, and certainly there's grounds for that as well. But I'm curious, is this, what sorts of sources are you looking at, and what do you attribute that to, if anything? Are they talking to sort of experts more? Is this sort of mainstream outlets, or is this due to the diversity of sources in our current age?
No, thanks for asking. Yeah, and what the problem with that is that I'm just talking about like the mainstream sources that I read. Before, I remember reading them, you know, while I'm doing research and stuff, and usually there's so much there's so many incorrect sort of facts and figures and things in there. What I'm finding is that there are more experts out there. There's better information. There's discussions like this with a public group of people. The problem is that I read my sources, and the other side reads their sources, and we never read each other's sources. So I'm not saying we're actually learning from each other in any way, shape, or form. But in terms of my sources, they seem to be getting better.
Right, and people who want accurate information maybe now can find it. One of our themes is what do you need to know, and how do you approach the next election as an informed citizen? So that's a little optimistic note. So thanks for indulging the follow-up. Now, I don't want to forget about Abby at the end.
And I'll just give a shout out to one journalist that I follow pretty closely, and that's Dara Lind, who used to be with Vox and is now with ProPublica. She's doing, I miss the fact that she's not with Vox anymore, because she's very, very knowledgeable, and she had very frequent stories that really explained a lot of what was going on with the changes in Trump administration policy. But she's now coming out with some more investigative stuff in ProPublica, so I highly recommend Dara Lind's work. To get back to the question of a sort of polarization and what can we do to address that. So we can look to the local levels for some hope, in the sense that I find that local officials are not as caught up in the polarization that you see at the federal level or even at the state level. And I argue that's for a few reasons. So one of them has to do with what I was saying before about refugee resettlement. There are certain things that local officials are required to do in response to immigrants, not only refugees, but especially. In terms of serving immigrants in K-12 schools, providing English language learners. And these things happen regardless of immigration status. And in that way, local officials really come to see immigrants as clients in some cases. In addition to that, I think local officials are very aware of the contributions that immigrants make as contributors to their communities, economically, so as consumers, as workers, as entrepreneurs, filling vacant Main Street shops with new businesses and restaurants and things of that sort. And they're very aware of that, and as a result, end up supporting immigrants as a result. So local officials can tend to be clear that immigrants are their clients, tend to be clear that immigrants are contributors locally. And then in addition to that, they don't have to be as caught up in the partisan debates, because they might have nonpartisan elections on the local level. They might have off-cycle elections on the local level. And so those progressive era reforms on the local level may shield them from some of that partisanship. So in that sense, we can look with hope to the local level. And we can see incorporation as sort of a two-way street, in which maybe local governments will be doing things that are helpful in terms of welcoming immigrants. But because it's a two-way street, we also need to think of what they're doing in order to inform the public, in order to help the public understand that there's going to be an adjustment process for immigrants, but there's also an adjustment process for the broader society. And we don't really have a federal immigrant integration system, so a lot of that really falls to the local level and involves a lot of creativity on the local level. And what I've found in my work is that we can really go back to sort of older social science theories about intergroup relations to understand when it works. So when can we push past that polarization? When can local governments successfully not only welcome immigrants and help them to adjust, but also address the broader public and help them to think about how society can adjust effectively to the presence of immigrants. And so we can look back to things like the contact theory that says that if you have endorsement of authority, so there's three conditions through which we can achieve sort of suspension of stereotypes in the midst of diversity. And one of them is the endorsement of authorities. So the local government can say, this is a good idea, we should get along, we should welcome these people. So that's step one, and that's something that's easier for them to do. The other two conditions are harder. So having a common project that people from different groups are working on together. That's second condition. And then the third, making sure that they're doing so on an even playing field. And that's probably the hardest one amidst various forms of socioeconomic and racial and ethnic stratification in our society. You can see that those three conditions could be met easily, for instance, in a school setting, for instance, in a university setting, and perhaps in some other settings, but it's a lot easier to do amongst youth and a lot harder to do amongst the broader public. But when local officials are aware of this, there are some creative things that they can do.
That's fascinating and really eye-opening, and I want to come back for one quick and then maybe one more complicated follow-up, or maybe they're both complicated. So one is that you mentioned that we don't have any real policy or system at the federal level. Should we and could we? Is that even a possibility, and would people support it? And then the other question is, this is a really fascinating look at the conditions for when and how this might work. I was wondering about when do you observe, if ever, sort of a backlash against whether it's refugee or other types of new forms of migration settlement, and is that, what is the role of race, ethnicity, other forms of identity in creating those sorts of reactions if they occur? The first one was federal. Okay. Yeah, and that could be just a one word if that's all there is on it. But
well, I'm very interested in this question. So when I first started this work, to me it seemed obvious that we should have a federal immigrant integration policy of some sort, that we should do more than we were already doing in order to effectively welcome and incorporate immigrants. My advisor, the sociologist Mary Waters, said, people learn English by watching TV, and I'm not so sure that we should create policies that might end up having forcible impacts on immigrants. And at the time, I sort of took that in and wasn't sure, but when we look at the current administration, I think that latter point begins to make a lot more sense to us. Should we have a federal immigrant incorporation process amidst all of the other things that we're doing in terms of enforcement? On the one hand, I would like to see our government being more welcoming, but I would worry about the sort of forcible assimilationist implications of it at the present time. And in terms of the question of where we see backlash, so the reason that I got into this work was that I had been visiting new immigrant destinations from beginning around 2003, so for quite a while now. And in 2006, in response to a House bill that wanted to criminalize illegal presence in the United States, or unauthorized presence in the United States, there were mass immigrant protests across the United States that some of you may remember in 2006. And that also sort of precipitated and led to a little bit of the rise of the Tea Party. But after those protests, we began to see sort of venue seeking. It became clear that that bill that was proposed at the House level wasn't going to pass, and that the more restrictive federal immigration reform wasn't going to go forward. And so there became sort of venue seeking. Where can we get this done? And Chris Kobach, who's been on the news a lot lately, was a big player in this of going to localities and saying, here's something you can do. You can pass an English-only ordinance. You can say that businesses cannot hire undocumented immigrants, that landlords cannot rent to undocumented immigrants. And a rash of these ordinances got passed across the United States, about 100 restrictive ordinances towards immigrants across the United States over a several-year period. And to me, there's a ton of attention to this. And justifiably so. But to me, it was very confusing because the places that I was visiting were completely the opposite. We're not doing this at all whatsoever, and in fact, we're extraordinarily welcoming. And so I studied those places for a while, but then in 2014, I did a survey to say, where does this really fall? Are most places going to be places that are going to be having this sort of backlash, or is it that most places are more welcoming? And what I found is that actually most places in the United States do sort of tend to be more welcoming. There are these places that have backlash. There have been different theories among scholars about why that is. Some have said it's because of racial and ethnic demographic change. But additional scholars have come in and said, actually, there's a lot of places that are experiencing racial and ethnic demographic change, and not all of them are doing this. What it seems to be related to is the partisanship and the venue seeking. So when you get elite cues from higher level Republican people saying we should do this, then in some cases you have conservative political entrepreneurs that take on this mantle, and these things happen on the local level. On the positive side, what I saw in my work is that often after restrictive episodes in localities, that becomes reined in, and there's sort of compensatory accommodation that follows.
Thanks. And I guess for David and Debbie as well, I'm curious how you see the role of race, the role of ethnicity, the role of identity. And David, you've written a very interesting, I recommend you all look up this really quick piece, blog post that David wrote responding to a Fox, one of these gaffes where you say what you're really thinking, right? And on Fox News, there was a report about illegal immigration coming in from 3 Mexican countries, which you tell an interesting analysis of what that means in terms of how Fox and how certain portions of the public see immigration writ large and who it's associated with. So I don't know if you want to talk about that or other aspects of how race factors into where we are with the enforcement system.
I mean, immigration is, of course, highly racialized, and that has been the priority of the administration, at least in terms of the framing of migration, the really bad dudes, MS-13, but it's all Latin America, and for Fox News, all Latin America is just Mexico. And so there's this conflation of all Latinos, both across nations, but then that can easily transgress citizenship status, where I become part of that category, even though I'm a citizen of this country. And so there is this very anti-Mexican, anti-Latino rhetoric that frames the whole debate. And really, in 2015, when he came down the escalator and said he was going to run for president, he started right off the bat, with that, and has led with that the whole time. And it's inspired a lot of supporters, as well. It's inspired mass shooters. It's inspired violence. And so that's just the name of the game. And it's not as if this hasn't been done before. Immigration history is filled with racist propaganda against migrants. So there's a lot, whether it's about the different forms of deviancy or criminality or bad health or low intelligence. These are highly racialized ideas that get passed from migrant group to migrant group. It just so happens that the largest group of migrants for the last 75 years have been Latin Americans. And so they've taken on the mantle and bore the brunt of that racial characterization. In previous times, it was Chinese immigrants and Jewish immigrants, all kinds of other groups at different times, and it flips back and forth. You can always recall another racist stereotype. That's the flexibility of it all, So it's easily distributed. I think with the Fox News, what that showed was this easy conflation of all groups, as Mexicans, and it's an easy target. And it's not that, there's, as I say in that little blog post, there's some things behind it. There's the sizable demographic prominence of Mexicans amongst the Latino population. There's the fact that a third of the nation used to be Mexico. So there's sort of reasons why we have these racial ideas in our head, but they don't, those are just facts. What the president is spewing aren't facts. What he's spewing is racist characterizations of migrants, and yeah, I can't make it more simple than that. So.
Yeah, no, but it's a good point that we should be clear if we're talking about the role of race or the role of racism,
right,
per se, and obviously related, but important to point out with some clarity which is actually occurring. Okay, back to
Sure.
Debbie on this.
Yeah, so I have a
topic.
lot of thoughts about this too. First, just on the
bet.
point you were just making, there's some work by a political scientist named Efren Perez where he does some implicit association tests, and he finds that in people's minds the word immigrant, illegal immigrant, and Latino and Hispanic are all jumbled together. These are interchangeable terms to a lot of people at an implicit level. Some of the work that I'm doing now is looking at attitudes about belonging and identity in Arizona and New Mexico, which in some ways are two very different states with two very different histories. But relative to the rest of the United States, they have an awful lot in common. But one big difference is that one is known for being more welcoming to immigrants, New Mexico, and one has more history of being less welcoming to immigrants, Arizona. And so we're interested in seeing what are the effects on attitudes about belonging and identity in these two places, not only among Latinos and immigrants living in those states, but among U.S.-born whites, thinking about your two-way story that you were talking about. And so on this question of backlash, what we're finding is that, in general, where there's backlash, it's backlash to an unwelcoming environment. You see that people whose attitudes are affected the most by where they live are Latinos in Arizona feel more alienated than Latinos in New Mexico. It really affects their sense of identity, their sense of how other people see them. And we find that some of the size of the effect is in some ways biggest for the US-born Latinos in Arizona who, like you were saying, they feel like, I was born here, I only speak English, and yet everybody treats me like I'm a criminal. And so it's this really big effects on them feeling alienated in their home. And so that's where there's this backlash. And then among white Democrats in Arizona, among the non-Hispanic whites that we study, partisanship plays a really big role, and white Democrats really also feel very alienated by their state government and where they live. We find that people really do distinguish between the different levels of government. They don't view their feelings about what they see with respect to immigration are very targeted towards the location where the policy decisions are being made. So their feelings of belonging are affected at the state level and what's happening at the state, and doesn't generalize to how they feel about the United States as a whole. So even though immigration can be a complicated issue where people feel like, I can't keep up with the headlines, I don't know what's going on, I don't know if I trust my own expertise to even have an opinion, they actually do a fairly good job about distinguishing what the state's doing versus what the federal government is doing. In terms of in New Mexico, we see very little backlash among conservative whites or white Republicans there. It's not zero, but it's smaller than what you see in terms of, again, I don't know if backlash is the right word, but an effect of being Latino or a white Democrat in an unwelcoming place is much larger than any backlash or impact on belonging and identity that you might find if you feel like you wish your place was less welcoming and it's more welcoming. So there is a trade-off. Someone's going to feel a little alienated, but it's a matter of which group is larger and which group feels it most. And we find that the unwelcoming environment has much more significant consequences. And then one last point again is also recognizing the heterogeneity of attitudes among Latinos. So we're saying this isn't just about immigration, it's about diversity and changing population demographics. And, I remember one of the most striking things right before the 2016 election was seeing candidate evaluation surveys looking at Latinos. It was a survey that was done by Gallup and the Washington Post, and huge differences if you break it down by nativity, U.S.-born versus foreign-born, and also English-dominant versus Spanish-dominant. And when we see things like, Donald Trump today, his approval rating among Hispanics is, I think, the low 30s or the 20s. I mean, it's not zero. And you might think, well, shouldn't it be zero? And it's not. And it's because there are some really big differences based on things like the percentage of one's life spent in the U.S. and whether they're English dominant or not. And so I think that's important to recognize also.
Awesome. So it's really interesting to hear about these comparisons along lines of ethnicity and partisanship, and how so interesting that they seem responsive to the state and local environment, where we often think of this as so national. I want to go back to something that I think is there in what everyone's talking about, but Debbie raised at the very beginning, that we've gotten a lot better at studying and understanding the attitudes of immigrants and ethnic minority citizens and voters themselves in terms of the ability to collect accurate data. So I wanted to go back and see sort of what we can do with that knowledge and how we should be thinking about the role of immigrants, not just as people that other people have attitudes about, but as citizens and voters and potentially activists and people who will arguably mattered a great deal in the last 2 election cycles already. So this is sort of for everyone at sort of any of these levels. What is the role of opinion, of political action, political activism among immigrants themselves, among ethnic minority citizens? So any of you jump in.
Sure, I'll go first. I think Abby mentioned the 2006 mega marches after the criminalization statute that was coming through the House at the time, and I think that's a good example of the kinds of activism that can take place, and that immigrants can't vote in elections, but they can do 10 other things that are highly politicized and are participatory, and that can change opinions. And I think that's a good example of one. Is marching in the streets, is spreading information, is changing the narrative. I think another good example would be when DACA was passed. That was really brought on by the immigrant youth themselves, and they changed the narrative. They got lawyers, and they forced the Obama administration to pass DACA, basically. And it was a shrewd political move at the time, in 2012, because of the kind of lack of polling of Latin American immigrants. No one knew that things were going to switch that way, because no one was asking the Latinos what they thought, the voters. And so the immigrants can do a lot of things and participate in all kinds of ways. I'm sure Abby has lots to say about how fully integrated they are into society. I think there's so much focus, especially for undocumented immigrants, on their status. And I think one of the things I try to remind myself, even in the educational setting, in this setting, is that status obviously impacts their lives, but it's not the most important thing at play in every moment. When we're teaching a class or taking a midterm exam, that has nothing to do with anything. So it's putting that status in its meaningful place. And sometimes it's not that meaningful. What's more meaningful is that the migrant is a parent, or is a student, or is a driver, or is a soldier, whatever, And so there's other roles they play, and I think we get overly focused on undocumented status or just non-citizenship status, even if it's lawful. And that's not always the most important element. And I think immigrants, as they participate in society and have fun and do everything that we all do, emphasize that, and we should also be emphasizing that.
So just electorally speaking, and in terms of voter mobilization, we know that mobilization matters and it works. I don't know if anyone in this room volunteers for a campaign or a candidate, and you get very demoralized when people hang up the phone on you or slam their door in your face and tell you to get off their lawn. But if any of you are doing that kind of work, you should know that it matters. I mean, we know from lots and lots and lots of studies that people who are mobilized are more likely to participate. They're more likely to vote. And we also know that there are disparities in who's likely to be mobilized. Yet even among what are called low propensity voters, mobilization efforts work. And so it's a matter of organizations, candidates, parties, nonpartisan get out the vote groups target low propensity voters, people who maybe aren't English dominant or naturalized citizens, immigrant communities, that those mobilization efforts work, but they are systematically less likely to be mobilized in the first place. The other big story, like one of the big stories coming out of the 2018 midterm elections was the surge in youth voter turnout. And one of my big soapboxes these days is that whenever we talk about young people today, we need to be talking about which young people, because it's also the most diverse generation in this country's history. And so young people are traditionally less likely to vote, but on top of that, you also have this generation being more diverse, and we know that people who aren't white are going to be less likely to be mobilized in the first place. So it's fantastic news that youth turnout was up so much in 2018, but it doesn't mean that people can just sit back and expect that they're going to turn out again. So recognizing that the importance of mobilization and to not fall into the trap of thinking, well, because this group has a low propensity of turning out, that it's a wasted effort to mobilize that group, because we know that that's not true and that the efforts do pay off.
And do we know if is mobilization more effective if it comes from sort of within a community or identity or ethnic group or in the same language even?
There might be people here who can speak more to that than me, but my sense is that yes, but marginally. I mean, I've seen studies where they vary things like the message of the turnout, or is the mailer in English or in Spanish, and there may be marginal differences, but the big differences are between being mobilized and not being mobilized, and that beyond that, you can boost it up a little bit in different ways, but it's being contacted in any which way, shape, or form is really important.
Yeah, you both said really great things, and I'll just add just some short things. So first, to echo what David said, the mobilization of undocumented youth has just been so incredibly extraordinary and so sophisticated. So undocumented youth are more likely than native-born youth to be involved in protest, for instance, and to be more involved in other forms, some other forms of engagement. And so the targeting of DACA right now is obviously extraordinarily heartbreaking as a result. To echo a little bit of what Debbie was saying, what would it mean to become politically incorporated at a time of declining participation in the United States and declining institutions of participation in the United States? So we know that we have declines in terms of union membership, we have declines in terms of churches, we have declines in terms of many other forms of sort of membership-based organizations. And of course we have declines that she's describing in terms of the we've gone from more of a wholesale political mobilization to more of a retail-targeted political mobilization. And so what does it mean? Is it possible to become politically incorporated in a time of decline in institutions? And one of the things that concerns me is that part of for those who are able to become naturalized, those immigrants who are able to naturalize, part of the motivation now is a defensive motivation. I need to naturalize in order to ensure that I won't be cut off of a certain kind of benefit, for instance, or that I'm able to access a certain kind of benefit that has been denied me. Or I need to naturalize because, God forbid something happens and I'm charged with something. I need to ensure that I'm not going to be subject to any sort of deportation. And so what does it mean to become incorporated into the United States if your reason for doing so is the defensive need to protect yourself?
I think I certainly could ask you guys even more questions, but I think we have a large audience that is probably ready to go, or at least maybe take a breath and formulate some thoughts. Are you going to go around? Okay. So take a moment. I think I was going to say I will warn my colleagues that I will tend to call on the students first. So guys, no pressure, but definitely especially eager to hear from those of you in the crowd who are students, but or community members as well, but certainly the floor is open to everyone. So just give a signal and you can get a mic or you can shout really loud, either way.
Thank you. So we've talked a little, Professor Hernandez mentioned a little bit about the polarization and how going to the middle ground in terms of the immigration debate isn't necessarily the right move, and I think a lot of us would probably agree on that. There's been a lot of talk about this word electability, so to bring this into the 2020 election a little bit, specifically the Democratic primary, and this is open to all the panelists, what do you think is the right move of the Democratic Party in terms of positioning themselves on the immigration debate? We have this problem of electability, and there's a lot of different views on whether or not that should be even considered as a metric for a primary candidate. But then we also talked a little about the thermostat response, and we worry that moving too far to one direction results in an overcompensation in the other direction with further elections and future elections. So what is your opinion on where the Democratic Party and the candidate that we eventually choose on should position themselves on the immigration debate?
Okay, so that is all right. So first, look backwards to 2016. It's important to remember just how close that election was. And what we know is that we like to say in political science that a lot of tinkering that happens during campaigns doesn't actually matter, because what really matters is how the economy is doing. Has the same party been in power for 2 presidential terms? Those kinds of things. What's presidential approval like? And that kind of dictates the election regardless of who the candidates are and what issue stances they take. Except when elections are very close, right? Then these little things can tip it a little bit. So it was very close then. It was, Hillary Clinton got more votes, a lot more votes, but she didn't get them necessarily in the right places. And so when we're thinking about what's going to be popular versus what's going to be popular in the particular states that will decide the race for one candidate versus another, and then which states are those, I don't think anyone really knows the answers to those. So my first response is that, well, if anyone says that they know the answer to this, they're not telling you the truth. I don't think we really know, honestly, because some people are saying it's the same 3 states, Michigan and Pennsylvania and Wisconsin, and others are saying, no, it's Arizona and Texas and Georgia are the states. And in those places, there's the approach of going with the thermostatic tide of public opinion I think can be a winning approach. But maybe it will be Wisconsin and Michigan. But even those places, too, are trending, I think they're trending less red than they were in 2016. So for now, I would say that I think going with the thermostatic, going with the tides of public opinion and doing what they think is right, not being afraid to say what they think is the right thing to do on immigration is probably what they should do. But given the Electoral College, I think it's more complicated than that.
There's a lot of candidates out there, and so anyone who's concerned about electability has all my respect, no matter who they're choosing, because everyone's afraid of the potential re-election of the current president. A lot of people are afraid. Some people are for it, I suppose. And but in terms of immigration politics, it's usually most politicians would just avoid it because it's such a challenging issue. It's so polarized, as we said. But the president, especially with some of his nastier policies, has provided cover for Democrats to say we're pro-immigrant. We can't put children in cages, and we can't do this, we can't do that. And so there is some room to sort of argue for immigrants before no one wants to. If they say, we're a nation of immigrants, we should support immigrants, but we should build a wall. We should, build a fence. Everyone voted for a fence 10 years ago. But with the kids in cages and the violent rhetoric, there's room for, I think, being more pro-immigrant from some of these candidates. But we'll see. I'm not sure. It seems like they'll probably just avoid the issue as best they can until pressed.
Hi, I have a comment and a question. So I found it really difficult. You had an optimistic ending, like Mobilize and Political Act, and how DACA was basically passed. But I found when the debate is framed around security issues, it's really hard to influence public opinion. So for instance, there are 2 secret programs that were in place for a decade. One is called CARP, which is the Controlled Application Review and Resolution Program, which has an informal name called Muslim Need Not to Apply. So if you are an asylum seeker or an immigrant in the United States and apply for a green card or waiting for an interview or to become a citizen, so your case will be held forever without any reason. So that case was revealed after a FOIA act by ACLU and in 2013. However, what I found in 2015, it was implemented as part of the refugee security screening, and they added another section called Syrian Enhanced Review, where CARP became an official policy in the United States. The second one was NESIR, which means National Entry-Exit Registration System, which was in place between 2002 until 2011, and Obama dismantled that program in a hope that he will stop a potential use of registration Muslim. However, Trump found another way by creating the executive order, which the so-called the Muslim ban or the travel ban. So after 3 rounds, it was approved by the Supreme Court. And like a full disclosure, I had 2 interviews, asylum interviews under Trump. So I have been waiting for over 6 years now for a decision. But the level and the kind of questions that I received under Trump, like 2 times, they were really absurd. Mostly cultural questions, random typos, and so to hold the life of applicant forever in limbo. And that's, in my opinion, is a public collective punishment. So they punish you for seeking asylum, they punish your family because they can't come here, and you can't travel outside the country. But more importantly, what is the rule of the state? For instance, in California, if you are undocumented, you can actually have a driving license. In Massachusetts, maybe it was missing from the public discussion, was they changed the law on April 2018, and I went to apply for, I have a valid I-20, I'm doing my PhD at the political science program here. But to my surprise, they changed the law so I couldn't get a driving license based on my application as a valid student in the United States. So I had to leave the country to get a new passport, Syrian passport, which you can get, and also a visa, a valid visa. So basically, it's you can't drive your own car. So the only way to do that is, and this is how the system is extracting money actually from applicant, is to apply for EED, which is the work permit, based on pending asylum application, which is valid for 2 years and costs around $410 without any other charges. So it's basically a vicious circle where you are trapped between the state and the federal. But what I found is there is a common understanding, because it's obvious that aggressiveness towards immigrants and refugees, regardless from where they are. But there are another level, actually, at the asylum level, where there are specific groups have been targeted with a specific question to match the terrorism bar, for instance. Kind of question I received, a Latino wouldn't receive. Like, if you went through a checkpoint, that might be ISIS. Even though, like, when I left Damascus, ISIS wasn't there. But it doesn't matter for them. So I find it really frustrating and difficult to change the debate, because even some of my students are compelled that, yeah, no, we are open, we love immigrants, but you have to come here legally. And when you do it legally, you are penalized. So there is no way around it, and I hope you have answer for a little bit of hope.
You want to go first, Abby?
Yeah, I really appreciate you sort of laying that out, because I think that it is in these individual stories that we begin to see like the labyrinth and the ridiculousness, the absurdity of our system. I mean, USCIS, the United States Citizenship and Immigration Service, it's a fee-funded government agency. It doesn't shut down when the rest of the government shuts down, because all of immigrants are paying these fees that allow it to keep it open. So yes, there's a lot in what you were just saying. And when people use that rhetoric that you hear of, well, we support immigrants but come legally, I just want to give you some things that you can respond in that, because people tend to say, you know, get in line. That's the rhetoric that's used. And so whenever you hear that, you can go to the State Department website and look up the current visa bulletin. So first of all, there are only limited lines to get in if you want to come to the United States. They're related to family reunification, so you have to have close family members that are already here. They're related to employment. That often means you have to have a very high level of skill, and in some cases related to refugee, asylee, and then we have a very, very tiny little diversity visa program. So there's very limited lines to begin with. And then those lines are ridiculous. So we have a rule that only 7% of legal immigrant flows in any given year can come from one country. So it doesn't matter if it's Luxembourg or if it's Mexico, only 7% can come. Only 7% of legal flows can come from that given country. And that means we end up with these tremendous backlogs, even outside of the insanity of our current asylum system. So for instance, if you are the unmarried adult son or daughter of a U.S. citizen, and you're coming from Mexico, they are currently processing visas from August of 1997. That's the line. That's the line to do it right. If you are trying to come via employment, and that means that an employer is sponsoring you, you are in line because an employer is sponsoring you, and you're in the third category, which is a skilled professional worker. So usually someone who, for instance, might have a BA but has high-level skills in terms of programming or statistical analysis, something like that. If you are from India, they are processing visas from January 2009. So people are waiting decades in these lines. So there really isn't a way to do this effectively under our current system. And I'm talking here about the legal permanent resident lines. We're not even talking about the huge demand that we're not addressing through those lines to begin with.
So there was a whole lot in Basil's comment as well, and I just wanted to pick up on the notion of the securitization of the discourse and how that affects policy, how that affects public debate, and specifically the so-called travel ban or Muslim ban, and the particular, we've been focused a lot, and I think fairly so, on animus against Mexicans and Latinos in general, but it's certainly worth pointing out that there is this other equally, if not more so, negative discourse relating to Muslims, and so I just wanted to flag that. If anybody wanted to pick up on that at all, feel free, or if not, we can move on.
Yeah, so you started by mentioning some of the optimistic things we've been saying, and I, to be honest, there are times where I'm accused of being the most optimistic person in the room, but even I have my limits sometimes, and shortly after 9/11, there were some surveys that were done about, would you support putting people who, at the time they were saying Arab or Arab American or Arab immigrants in camps until their innocence could be determined if there were another attack. And support was in the mid-30s. And then I did a survey a couple years later, so 2004. Opinion hadn't changed. It was roughly in the mid-30s. And I suspect that if you asked that question today, you would find support maybe in the mid-30s. So, yeah, I mean, there's fear, and there are, sometimes I go back to, in my political psychology class, we teach about the Milgram experiments, and we spend time talking about, is there something unique about the United States? Or I ask my students, I say, turn around and look at your classmates. Do you think your classmate would follow orders to harm someone unjustly? Under what conditions would someone do something horrible to another person because they were told to or because they're afraid? And there's a quote from Milgram that he says, in any mid-sized American town, you could find enough people to man a concentration camp. That was basically his view. And there isn't necessarily a reason to think that's changed. What we look to are institutions and rule of law and honestly the thermostatic nature of public opinion to try to help us with those tendencies, because we may veer towards that, and then we ideally and at times in the past have corrected. But that doesn't mean we won't veer back again as we, that thermostat moves back and forth. The other is in some of the research that I've done with qualitative work. You hear, on the one hand, when you were talking, we might be thinking, well, if more people knew the experience of interacting with government bureaucracy as an immigrant, people might have more sympathetic attitudes. But we also see from work, and I've seen in work that I've done, that people have a tendency to say, well, the people that I know are the good ones, right? And so they don't necessarily generalize. Even hearing your story wouldn't necessarily lead people to generalize to their attitudes about immigration or immigrants. In general, they would partition you off and say, well, he's one of the good ones trying to do things right, and he's being stymied by the government, but everyone else is a different story.
I would just add that I met someone, I was in Amsterdam this summer, and I met a cab driver who had been to the United States a dozen times, has family here, and now gets his visa rejected or put back. Apply again in 6 more months. And it was because of the Muslim ban. And he didn't know. I was trying to explain it in my short cab ride. And so I think you explained the complexity of it, the ridiculousness of it very well. I think this is what's different about the Trump administration. Our first question is that, so much of our focus is oftentimes, and for very good reason, on bringing relief to migrants who are suffering, undocumented migrants, DACA, et cetera. But what we see differently in this administration is the legal channels being constricted. You know, the perfectly normalized legal channels that have always been used, including family reunification, you know, being restricted. And so now there's discussions of getting rid of, there's always discussions of getting birthright citizenship, getting rid of it, but now it takes on a different life under this president. And so we have to remember that those so when people say, like, we have to talk about the lawful channels and expanding those as well, and in addition to providing relief for the undocumented. And they have to go hand in hand. Before, it's usually one or the other, but it has to be both. And so I think that your example helps us think about that.
Yeah, that's a great point. And we've had, what else, the diversity visa, which Abby mentioned, under attack, and temporary protected status under threat as well. All, like you said, perfectly normal legal channels. Okay.
So
yeah,
so thank you. Really great panel. I don't work in this space. It's fascinating to learn all that you know. I feel like I need to find another way, other channels to get information like this on a regular basis. So one question I have for you is, like, do you recommend podcasts or other ways that I can absorb this information easily? A second one is around the role of Islamophobia. We kind of maybe already touched on that, but is that something at play here, and how do we maybe counter it if it is? The third question is, you talked about that contact theory and ways to maybe effective integration involves creating common projects that, but also you level the playing field so people have like similar ability to participate in that. If you could give some examples, like what are some examples of a common project? So 3 big questions. Feel free to answer any or none at all. Thanks.
Thank you. Do you want to start maybe with the last one, Abby? Do you have examples?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'll talk about sort of 3 different categories of things that are being done. So some of the things that local governments do in response to immigrants are things like engaging with immigrant communities. So you see that through things like hosting events celebrating diversity or promoting intercultural interaction. Including immigrants in decision-making, so appointing immigrants to boards and commissions, and providing services to immigrants, and often this happens through a partnership with local NGOs. So about 40% of local governments in the United States, through my survey, say that they're partnering with local organizations to provide services to immigrants. So those are the things that are sort of happening. In terms of actually achieving the conditions of the contact theory, that's a lot more challenging. You definitely see it in schools. You definitely see it through things even like youth sports, where you have people getting together for some sort of common project. They're on an equal playing field. You have the endorsement of the coach for the suspension of stereotypes and the project of harmony. And you see their parents, for instance, working together at concession stands. There's some other places where I see it. So Lewiston, Maine is a very interesting case where Somali refugees who were secondary migrants, they'd been settled elsewhere in the United States, and they moved to Lewiston, which meant that Lewiston really wasn't prepared for their arrival in any way, shape, or form. And they began arriving in February of 2001. Lewiston is best known for a restrictive response to those Somali refugees. The mayor, a few years in, wrote a letter saying, "Please stop coming," which of course he didn't have a right to say because they had freedom of movement throughout the United States. White supremacists came in and said, "Good job, Mayor." But the community itself organized a massive counter rally. And the local government was really intricately involved in that. In addition to that, they hired Vista volunteers who worked for a period of years. And so this was a very low-cost intervention. And yet the Vista volunteers really worked on this model of creating neighborhood projects that brought people together to work together about things that needed to be fixed in their local communities. And so it didn't have to be something that was a massive, costly project. And I'll just say that one exciting thing that happened in the recent election is that Safiya Khalid, a Somali refugee, was elected to the Lewiston City Council. She's the first elected Somali American representative. And so, you know, even in a place that experiences this kind of initial restriction, and I will say, even in a place that also went for Trump, because Lewiston ended up voting for Trump in 2016, you can still see this kind of local contact. She did an amazing door-to-door campaign, winning out.
We still have on the table podcasts and Islamophobia. You have podcasts too? Okay.
I'm a podcast devotee, so. I think This American Life does, the real old-fashioned podcasts and NPR programs, they do amazing reporting on immigration. If you go onto their webpage and you search for their immigration programming, you will find so many good things that date all the way back to the 1990s even. Dara Lind, who I mentioned earlier, does the podcast The Weeds, which is a Vox podcast. And if you search, I would say every 2 months they'll have a episode on immigration, which is really fascinating.
Okay, and Deb, you spoke a bit to issues of Islamophobia, but anything further?
So again, the reason I'm hesitating is because the American people are just so complex. And so on the one hand, yes, it's definitely undeniably a factor in American attitudes about immigration, even though, as I said earlier, the first thing that comes to mind when people hear immigration is Hispanic immigration. They think of Mexican immigration, they think of illegal immigration, is the first thing they think of. So I think unless you're specifically asking about immigration from Muslim countries, it's not the first thing that comes to people's mind. But when you do, there's a fear and apprehension. At the same time, I'm thinking about, the reason I was hesitating is I was thinking about the public opinion work on political tolerance and kind of which groups is it okay to have someone teach in your public schools or have a book in the library or give a speech in your community. And when you ask about different groups there, the groups that people still dislike the most are actually atheists, right? People want you to believe in something, and what they don't like is if you don't believe in anything. I remember a few years ago, I was on the board of overseers for the American National Election Study, and this was during the Obama-Romney campaign, and we were talking about which questions to add, and I was actually asking the American public about, because the American National Election Study has been asked every election pretty much since 1952, so we have this great time series, and whenever we add a new question, it's great to track over time, and I was advocating for asking a question about, do people think that they would ever vote for a presidential candidate that was atheist, and in a room full of political scientists, they were like, no way, no how, never going to happen, we can't waste precious time on our survey with a question like that. So that's what I mean, it's complex. I think there's room to grow, and I think people are open to, with efforts like the ones that Abby's describing, for Islamophobia to definitely be ameliorated, and when people are in communities that are changing, but when there's efforts to make that happen more smoothly, I think it can work. And like I said, people really don't like it if you don't believe in anything, or at least that's how they see it.
Great. I think there's a question in the front there. Yep.
Yeah. Hi. I guess my question is, in terms of immigration, we talked about immigration with Latinx people and Muslim and Islamic people, but I think oftentimes I feel like there are other groups, and for me specifically, just because I guess I relate to it more, there's also a huge immigration issue in terms of African and Caribbean people. Oftentimes I have family members from Africa who are seeking asylum or trying to come to the United States because of the multiple civil wars going on and the different things in terms of Boko Haram and different things like that. How can we go about advocating for those groups? Because yes, there are also young people and they're trying to start a new life, get a new job, but there are also times when they're grandmothers and who are people who can't really work anymore because they're older and they have different health needs and just different needs in general and can't really do anything. And in order to really get citizenship in this country, you have to kind of have an excuse or a reason. My question is how can we go about advocating for those people so that they don't go unrecognized, and also how can we change the system so that the people who just want to come to seek asylum, of course we want them to be contributors to our society, but also just safe, because at the end of the day they're leaving to survive. They're not leaving to do anything else.
Great, really important question. Yeah.
Thank you. That's a Mount Holyoke student, by the way.
Hey.
Which is a few. Thank you, Wilma, for your question. I think you raise a huge issue in terms of just the demographic complexity of immigrants, even though that in terms of enforcement, 90% of people that are apprehended, detained, and deported come from Latin America. Over 90%. And so virtually everybody, almost. But at the same time, race plays a role, especially black persons from the Caribbean or from Africa in terms of policing, because of the generalized racist policing in the United States already. They bear the brunt, even though they're smaller numbers, but the higher percentages of arrests of all those numbers are for black migrants. And in terms of Dominicans, Cubans, Jamaicans, people from Africa, et cetera. And so it's important to keep that in mind and to be reminded of those demographics. And for integration, every aspect, it matters. But those racial factors, which play obviously an important role in the history of the United States, have to be confronted at all times, and we have to be reminded of your question at all times.
I guess, it sounds trite to say, but I mean, elections have consequences. We've seen that in 2016. And not to say, from the things you said earlier, it's not like, Obama was the champion that people had hoped he would be. I think a lot of people would make that trade now if they could. And so, yeah, making sure that you have the people in office that are sympathetic to the view and that support the policies you want is one of the best ways to get the policies that you want. And so whether that means working electorally, or it could also mean working through the courts, who people, elections have consequences for who the judges are. So just it's hard work, and it's a lot of work, but that work does matter for who's in office. So to not get beat down by what seems so depressing around you, because we know, again, we know that the efforts at organizing and activism, it's a long, long fight, but it does work. And I think that's it's a long fight. It's not, you can't give up when you lose particular battles along the way, because you will, but that in the long run, making sure that sustained activism and organization it's not an easy answer, but it's, I think, the answer.
Okay, I think we've got a couple minutes left, and I see at least 2 questions, if not more. So if anyone else wants to jump in, now's the time. Mohammed, maybe you can ask your question and then bring the mic up, and we can collect the last 2 or maybe 3 and then give it a go.
Okay, so I want to say a word about Islamophobia. So there is actually a Journal of Islamophobia Studies associated with University of California, Berkeley. And a lot of this discussion was about domestic politics and national politics, but I think there's a lot of international connection as well, like how international events are influencing how Americans think and stuff. And I think at this point, liberal politics or leftist politics has basically died down. It's over. Today, we heard the ex-army general of India said openly on live that he supports the death and rape of Kashmiri women. And India is an ally of America at this point. They're about to deport or detain up to 2 million Muslims in Indian state of Assam. And in Indian Kashmir, more than 10,000 boys are missing. And I can go on and on about those facts. So those alliances really define who Americans are and their values and everything. And the axis of Islamophobia is very global. Initially, we thought it was Western, but now the most Islamophobic countries are in Asia. And they are strong allies of the right wing in Europe, who visited Indian-occupied Kashmir a few weeks ago.
Thanks, Mohammed. And up here.
So the question regarding the criminalization of immigration that was raised by the Mount Holyoke student kind of made me ponder some of the things that I've been hearing in terms of, immigration offenses or just apprehensions by police are on the rise, becoming one of the most, right after drug offenses, they're becoming some of the major ways that people get caught up, not only in the immigration system, but also in America's prison system. And I was wondering if the panelists could speak to the larger issue of immigrants now having to pay even more fines and going through lawyer fees, and that essentially even legal immigration has, under this administration and once prior, the act of legal immigration has become even more, subjugated, oppressed, and it's been, so I was just wondering if you could speak to specifics maybe in this administration and how even maybe immigrants are being forced due to being incarcerated and detained and forced in different types of prison labor, and speak to that larger.
Thank you. Yeah, great question. And I think we'll end there, but I think, oh, do we have one more? Okay. Real quick, and then, okay, a piggyback, perfect.
Kind of. I was just wondering, in addition to that, if you could speak to how the court system is affecting immigration, like whether it's the backlog of cases that build up and how that is affecting judges' decisions on how they're deciding whether or not immigrants can reside in the country, or whether it's the different districts and their rates of acceptance versus non-acceptance, and just the overall court system and its effect on immigration.
Great.
Thank you.
Two great questions to end on. Thank you. Okay. Who wants to?
I'll say one thing to try to tie them together is that, and it's for everyone's kind of political agenda after this meeting, is to decriminalize things. We should avoid that court system, and there's a lot of there's a general response that everything needs to be a crime, and then that the crime is what triggers deportation proceedings, et cetera, and so you can do a lot by taking away the crime, by decriminalizing it, by making it just a fine or a ticket that you get at a curb instead of being hauled into the local police department, who then shares your information with the federal government, et cetera, et cetera. On a state level, what happened in California several years ago is that they took the misdemeanor, which could be as high as a 365-day sentence, which triggers deportation. They changed the law and made it 364 days, which does not trigger deportation. And so you can create efforts that take away those criminal effects which trigger the immigration effects. And that's something you can do at the local level, at the state level, and you can pressure your congresspeople to do now.
Brilliant. Okay. Please join me in thanking our three wonderful panelists for a really great session. Thank you so much. And thank you all for coming.